How could a pastor and theologian start a colony without mentioning God, God's will, God's kingdom, or God's blessings in its founding documents? The answer lies in the principle of separation of church and state. In the 1600s, a man by the name of Roger Williams saw a growing problem with the colony of Massachusetts. He was afraid that the state, which he believed was corrupt, would eventually corrupt how people worshiped God. And this disagreement grew so bitterly between Williams and the Puritans in Massachusetts that they asked him to leave with the threat that if he returned, it was possible that he would be executed. Roger Williams managed to escape, and he started the colony known as Providence, which we would know of as Providence, Rhode Island. See, unlike in Massachusetts, nothing in Providence founding documents declared they were starting God's kingdom on earth. It did not claim anything about God's will. It did not ask God's grace or blessings. In essence, nothing in the founding documents said, "In God we trust." God was not mentioned in the documents at all. Well, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, their tension, it got greater, and it forced Roger Williams to go to the English Parliament across the Atlantic Ocean in order to get this experiment that Roger Williams was trying to do verified, so they were able to stay safe from other colonies. Now, what's fascinating here is that the Church of England was actually pro-Church of England. They were completely okay with this, but they gave Roger Williams, because of a packet or pamphlet that he was passing around, they gave him permission to try this experiment. See, he created a pamphlet which he developed into a book titled The Bloody Tenets, and in this pamphlet he said this. He says, "When they have opened a gap in the hedge of wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, that God hath ever broke down the wall itself, removed the candlestick, and made his garden a wilderness." Old English can be confusing, but he was saying that if the wall was removed between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the state, that the wilderness would not become a garden, but in fact, the garden would become a wilderness. March 14th, 1633, Roger Williams received his charter and was able to create this idea of separation of church and state. See, and as we can see, separation of church and state is not separating the influence of the religious viewpoints onto the government, because we see that Roger Williams applied his religious expression onto the government and created freedom. It was to protect the religious expressions of people from the government. And this principle ended up in the Bill of Rights, as well as in Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, which says that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Some states struggled with this idea so much that they required up until the late 1800s that in order to hold an office in their state, an individual must be a Protestant. But from a federal perspective, this idea of church and state has existed since its formation. What we see historically is that at times the church will conflict with the ideas of government, and at times vice versa. See, in the late 1800s, Congress decided to outlaw polygamy, which it viewed as dangerous to the social well-being of the nation as a whole, and this was in straight confrontation to how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was practicing their religion. And religious organizations and the government have struggled with LGBTQ issues over the last 40 years, which many people can say this is my religious expression. And so at times we see that these do conflict. Do these government rulings on this violate this idea of separation of church and state? Quite possibly. See, there is a natural desire that for people in power, whether religious or not, to naturally break down the wall into the garden and let the wilderness loose. Christians have a habit of doing this. Secular people have a habit of doing this. Anyone in power attempts to do this naturally, which is why it is so important for the principle of separation of church and state to be fought for by everyone. So, what does this mean for us? First, is the separation of church and state forbids the government of making laws impacting individual religious expressions. Second, religions of all kind are free to speak into and try and change the government as long as they are not impacting that they are impacting or making it legal or illegal for people to practice their religious expressions. Third, at times, the state and religions will clash. It is everyone's responsibility to try and work through these issues together, realizing that it is going to be messy. And lastly, I think Roger Williams' summary of the state is incredibly accurate. It is a wilderness that by its very nature will take over whatever it touches. We as citizens must keep on guard and keep the government walled in from impacting its citizens' freedoms and religious expressions. Thanks for joining.